Part 1. The BTK Case, the chilling story of Dennis Rader. Welcome to Room 57, where we explore the most chilling true crime stories and mysterious cases. Today, we will dive into one of the most infamous and terrifying cases in American history, the BTK case involving Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader was a man who was thought to be the ideal father and husband, but few knew that behind this image was the infamous BTK Killer, a sadistic murderer who terrorized the city of Wichita, Kansas, for more than 30 years. The name BTK stands for bind, torture, kill, representing the brutal and methodical way in which the killer executed his horrific crimes. With his intricate methods and anonymous letters sent to the police, BTK managed to stretch the investigation over decades, keeping everyone in suspense. In today's video, we will walk you through the entire timeline of events, from the start of the case to the eventual unmasking of BTK's true identity. Join us as we uncover the terrifying story of Dennis Rader, the man behind the BTK murders, who made an entire nation tremble with fear. The early years, Wichita, Kansas, 1970 Wichita, Kansas. In the 1970s seemed like a quiet, peaceful city, located in the heart of the United States. It was a middle-class community where people led simple lives. However, what the residents didn't know was that an unstoppable killer was operating silently in the background, making the entire community live in fear for many years. Dennis Rader, the man who would later be known as BTK, was thought to be just another family man, a loving father and husband. He had a family, a steady job, and was well respected by the people around him. Little did they know, he was hiding a dark secret beneath the surface. Rader married Paula and had 2 children, living a life that seemed to fit the image of a perfect family man. He was known as an active member of his local church and worked for the city's code enforcement department. But behind that image was a cold-blooded killer obsessed with control and violence, who would go on to commit gruesome murders in the most methodical and terrifying ways. The first murders, the Otero family on January 15, 1974, BTK's first victims were the Otero family, which included Joseph, Julie, and their 2 children, Joseph Jr. and Shirley. They were brutally murdered in their home in Wichita, Kansas. This marked the first of many brutal killings carried out by BTK, sending shockwaves through the city. The method of the crime: BTK entered the Otero home, bound the family members, tortured them, and then murdered them. The brutality of the act was evident in the way BTK executed his plan, being meticulous and calculated in every step. After the killings, he left the crime scene without leaving any significant traces, making it hard for the police to identify the suspect. However, BTK's ego led him to send an anonymous letter to the police, detailing the crime and taunting them for failing to catch him. The ongoing murders and the strange evidence 1974 to 1980s. After the Otero murders, BTK seemed to disappear for a period of time, despite law enforcement's efforts to track him down. No significant evidence was found, and the case seemed to go cold. However, in 1978, BTK struck again. This time, his victims were Catherine Bright and her brother, Kevin Bright, in Park City, a suburb of Wichita. The murder was carried out in the same brutal manner as the Otero families, but this time, Kevin Bright survived. Kevin was able to provide a partial description of the killer, which gave police a faint hope of catching the elusive murderer. However, once again, BTK vanished without a trace, and the case remained unsolved. In the years that followed, Rader would continue to commit a series of murders, with each one more terrifying than the last. He primarily targeted women, and each murder followed the same pattern: finding the victims, torturing them, and finally killing them. Shirley V. in 1985 and Nancy Fox 1977 were among his next victims. Once again, Rader left cryptic letters, taunting the police and public, detailing his crimes and daring authorities to catch him. The silent years, a cold case 1980s, 2000s. As the years went by, BTK's murders seemed to stop. There were no new killings, and the case eventually went cold. The police had no new leads, and the community began to fear that the killer had either died or stopped his killing spree. For the next decade, BTK remained silent, and the case was all but forgotten. But then, in 2004, Dennis Rader, the man who had blended in so seamlessly with society, decided to break his silence. At the time, he was still living his life as a respected member of the Park City community. With a steady job and family, Rader's need for attention and control, however, pushed him to reach out to the police once more. In 2004, Rader reappeared, sending new letters to the police that included disturbing details about his past crimes, details that hadn't been released to the public. This prompted a reopening of the case, with new leads emerging, which would eventually lead to Rader's capture. The investigation reignites. The final breakthrough in 2005, when the new letters emerged. Police began to realize that BTK was still active. With the advancement of DNA technology, to find new clues, leading them to focus on Dennis Rader. In 2005, Dennis Rader was finally arrested, and he confessed to all of the murders he had committed. Over the years, Rader's confession sent shockwaves through the public. The man, who had lived an ordinary life in the community, was revealed to be one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. His shocking confession, detailing his violent acts and twisted motives, left everyone stunned and horrified. Conclusion of Part 1. The BTK case is a chilling reminder of how appearances can be deceiving. Dennis Rader, a man who seemed like the ideal father and husband, was hiding a dark, monstrous secret for over 30 years. He eluded capture, using his letters and calculated methods to taunt the police and control the investigation. In the end, modern forensic technology and relentless investigation helped bring his dark secret to light. Stay tuned for the next part, where we will dive deeper into the chilling details of Rader's confession, his capture, and the shocking revelations about his life as the BTK Killer. Part 2. The investigation and the search for the chilling nature of the letters. A serial killer's taunt after the horrific murders of the Otero family. In 1974, Dennis Rader remained silent for several years. However, he soon became increasingly bolder, sending letters to local media outlets and the police. These letters, which would become a hallmark of his crimes, were written in a highly disturbing manner and added a new layer of complexity to the investigation. In one of his first letters, Rader described in eerie detail how he committed the murders, giving specific facts that were not released to the public. In the letter, he also mocked the police, daring them to catch him and claiming that he would continue killing unless they were able to stop him. The letters were signed with the now infamous BTK, bind, torture, kill, a phrase that would haunt the city of Wichita for years to come. The chilling content of these letters sent shockwaves through the community. Residents of Wichita were terrified, not just by the brutal nature of the murders, but also by the psychological games that BTK was playing with the authorities. His letters were not just confessions, they were taunts aimed at the police, making it clear that he relished the fear he was spreading. For the next several years, the police and media were under constant pressure to find the killer. But with every passing letter and new crime, BTK seemed to stay one step ahead of the law. His ability to evade capture and continue taunting the police made him one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history. The break in the case, a brief silence and growing despair. 1980s. After a few years of murders and chilling letters, BTK fell silent. There was a long gap between the 1970s and 1985, a silence that left investigators wondering whether the killer had stopped or was simply lying low. The killing stopped, but so did the letters. It was almost as though BTK had disappeared off the face of the earth, and for a while, investigators began to feel like the case might never be solved. This silence, however, was a double-edged sword. While it meant fewer victims, it also allowed the police to regroup and re-examine the evidence in hopes of finding a lead. Despite the lack of new murders, the case was far from over. The public was still gripped by the terror of the earlier murders, and the police, despite their best efforts, had no suspects or reliable leads. During this time, Wichita residents were left in constant fear, unable to feel safe in their own homes. The knowledge that there was a psychopath living among them, someone who had committed multiple murders and had gotten away with it, was a constant source of anxiety. For many, it felt like BTK had simply vanished into thin air, perhaps to start his killing spree elsewhere. The cold case reopens, the return of BTK's letters. 2004. As the years passed, technology improved and the methods used to investigate cold cases became more advanced. But it wasn't technology that reignited the BTK investigation. It was Dennis Rader's own ego that would bring him back to the forefront of the case. In 2004, after a 17-year silence, BTK reappeared. Rader, now a man in his 50s, had moved on with his life. He was still living in Park City, Kansas, with his wife and children. He had a respectable job with the local municipality, and on the surface, he appeared to be a regular, law-abiding citizen. However, behind closed doors, his urge to kill had never truly gone away. He had merely been lying in wait. This time, Rader's return wasn't through another grisly murder. Instead, he sent a letter to a local newspaper. This letter, much like his earlier ones, was filled with eerie detail about his past killings. In the letter, Rader discussed his tactics, and he even went as far as to claim he had been watching his victims for years before committing the murders. He also revealed that he had been actively stalking new victims and threatened to kill again. The letter Rader sent in 2004 was even more disturbing than his previous ones. It was typed out on a personal computer, an indication that technology was catching up with the criminal. It wasn't just a confession, it was also an act of control. The letter detailed a complicated puzzle that he challenged the police to solve. essentially daring them to figure out who he was. It was as if Rader had lost the thrill of killing and now craved the attention and challenge of law enforcement. Rader's letter, along with some new forensic analysis, would reignite the investigation into the BTK killings, and for the first time in years, investigators had something to work with, but they still had no clue as to who BTK really was. The breakthrough, new DNA evidence, and a break in the case. 2005, the breakthrough in the case came when DNA technology began to be used in criminal investigations more widely. In 2004, law enforcement began revisiting old evidence, and forensic experts were able to extract DNA samples from items found at crime scenes. A key piece of evidence came from a DNA sample found on a letter sent by BTK in 2004. The sample was analyzed, and it was traced back to a close family member of Dennis Rader. The connection to Rader was shocking, yet it was just the beginning. Investigators were able to piece together information from Rader's past, leading them to investigate his personal life and movements during the years the murders occurred. They found that Rader had been living in the Wichita area throughout the time of the murders. He had lived a double life for decades, hiding his true identity behind a carefully crafted persona of an ordinary, family-oriented man. As the DNA evidence pointed more definitively to Rader, authorities finally had the final piece of the puzzle. Dennis Rader was indeed BTK, the man who had eluded capture for more than 30 years. Dennis Rader's capture and confession 2005. In February 2005, the long search for BTK came to an end. The police arrested Dennis Rader, who had lived a relatively quiet life as a member of the community. On his arrest, Rader confessed to all of the murders he had committed, offering disturbing and meticulous details about each killing. He explained how he had planned the murders and the twisted joy he had derived from the act of taunting the police and playing games with them for so many years. Rader's confession shocked not only the public, but also his own family, who had never suspected him of such crimes. He was arrested at his home, and investigators searched his house for evidence. The evidence they uncovered confirmed his involvement in all of the BTK murders, and Rader was charged with 10 counts of murder. At his trial, Dennis Rader showed little emotion, maintaining a cold and detached demeanor throughout the proceedings. His motives were unclear, though it was evident that he derived a sense of power and control from his murders, and his ability to elude the law for so long. Conclusion of part to the case of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, is one of the most shocking and disturbing true crime stories in U.S. history. For over 30 years, this seemingly ordinary man was able to hide in plain sight, terrorizing the community and leaving law enforcement with nothing but clues and letters to decipher. His eventual capture was the result of both modern forensic techniques and the killer's own ego, which led him to break his silence and expose himself. In the next part, we will dive into Rader's confession, his trial, and the disturbing reality that he was living among his victims for so many years. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the mystery of the BTK Killer. Part 3. Dennis Rader's confession, trial, and the shocking revelations. Dennis Rader's confession, unmasking the monster. In February 2005, after years of evading the law and taunting police with his cryptic letters, Dennis Rader was finally arrested. The capture of the BTK Killer, who had terrorized Wichita, Kansas for over 30 years, was a moment that shook not only the city, but the entire nation. Rader's arrest marked the end of a decades-long manhunt and led to a chilling confession that sent shockwaves through the public. Rader, now a 60-year-old man, was arrested at his home in Park City, Kansas. His arrest came just a few weeks after he sent his final letter to the media, taunting law enforcement one last time. When police arrived at his house, Rader appeared unfazed by the magnitude of his capture. He had lived a seemingly normal life, married, with 2 children, a job, and a respectable position in his community. But now, the truth was finally being exposed. The police had enough evidence to bring Rader in, but it was his confession that provided the ultimate proof. Dennis Rader admitted to being BTK, taking full responsibility for the murders that had haunted Wichita and the surrounding areas for over 3 decades. His confession was not just a simple acknowledgement of his crimes, it was a detailed, cold, and methodical recounting of each of the 10 murders he had committed, along with the twisted motives behind them. Rader's confession was chilling in its detachment and lack of remorse. In a confidential interview with investigators, he revealed how he had carefully planned each of his murders, taking the time to stalk his victims, sometimes for weeks before striking. He explained that the binding, torturing, and killing of his victims gave him a sense of power and control, a feeling that he desperately craved. Rader's cold, calculating approach. Rader described in great detail the psychological pleasure he derived from the planning process of each murder. He had a particular ritualistic approach to his killings, often spending hours at the crime scene, making sure the victims were bound and controlled in a way that suited his need for dominance. He would carefully select his victims, often choosing single women, and use his job and status as a way to blend in without drawing suspicion. The nature of the murders, particularly the ritualistic aspect, revealed the sadistic tendencies that drove Rader to kill. He wasn't just interested in ending the lives of his victims. He wanted to prolong their suffering and terrorize them before finally killing them. It was evident that Rader enjoyed the psychological game he played with his victims and the police. For him, the act of murder was not just about the physical act of killing. It was about manipulating and controlling every aspect of the crime, from the planning to the taunting messages sent to authorities. The victims, faces of the forgotten while. Rader's detailed confession shed light on his personal motivations. The victims of the BTK killings remained central to the case. Their names and stories were often overshadowed by the media frenzy surrounding Rader's capture and trial. It is essential to remember that each of these individuals had lives, families, and dreams, and they were not simply victims. They were people with their own stories and aspiration. Tragically cut short by Rader's twisted need for power, the Otero family, who were Rader's first victims, were a deeply affected group. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their children Joseph Jr. and Shirley, were murdered in the early hours of January 15, 1974. Rader had taken their lives in a manner that was not just brutal, but meticulously planned. The family's loved ones struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could have occurred to them. Other victims, like Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox, were also murdered in ways that left lasting scars on their families. Vian, a single mother of 3, was bound and strangled in her home in 1985. Her children were fortunately not home at the time, but the emotional toll on them and their extended family was profound. Similarly, Nancy Fox was killed in 1977, and her body was discovered in a similar manner to the Otero family's murders. Fox's family had lived for years without knowing what happened to her, and the discovery of Rader's involvement sent shockwaves through her loved ones. Through Rader's confession, the grieving families were finally able to understand the horrific details behind their loved ones' deaths. However, this knowledge did not bring closure or comfort. It only deepened the trauma, as the graphic nature of the murders was more than anyone could have ever imagined. The trial, a shocking moment in court after his arrest and confession. Dennis Rader faced trial for the 10 murders he committed. His trial began in 2005, and it was a moment that captivated the nation. The trial was highly publicized, and the graphic details of Rader's crimes were aired for the world to see. What was most disturbing about Rader's trial was the coldness with which he conducted himself. He showed little to no emotion as the prosecution presented evidence of his crimes, and he seemed almost detached from the gravity of his actions. Throughout the trial, Rader was presented as the model citizen, a man who had lived an ordinary life and was deeply embedded in his community, making the revelation of his dark side all the more shocking. During the proceedings, Rader's defense team tried to portray him as a man who had been suffering from mental illness and lacked control over his actions. They argued that his past, his upbringing, and experiences had contributed to his behavior. However, the prosecution dismissed this notion, arguing that Rader's meticulous planning and psychological manipulation of his victims showed that he was fully aware of his actions. The trial also included a series of victim impact statements from the families of the victims. These statements were an emotional and heart-wrenching reminder of the human cost of Rader's actions, as family members spoke about the pain they had endured over the years. The full extent of the suffering caused by Rader's crimes became painfully clear. Rader's sentence. In aftermath, in August 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Despite his confession and the overwhelming evidence against him, Rader's lack of remorse and cold demeanor throughout the trial made the sentence feel almost anticlimactic. He was not given the death penalty, despite the brutality of his crimes, and was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains to this day. Rader's sentence marked the end of a nightmare for the families of the victims, but it did not bring true closure. For years, they had lived in the shadow of a man they never suspected. The fear and confusion surrounding the case had left deep scars on the community, and even though Rader was caught, the long-lasting effects of his actions could never truly be erased. In the years following his conviction, Rader's case became a symbol of the danger of serial killers blending into society and living among their victims. His story served as a reminder of how normalcy can often be a mask for evil, and how people can be living in close proximity to monsters without ever knowing it. Conclusion: the legacy of the case of Dennis Rader BTK is a tragic and chilling reminder of the evil that can hide behind ordinary facades. It serves as a warning of how some of the most terrifying criminals can walk among us, unnoticed and undetected for years, even decades. Rader's ability to evade capture for so long, combined with the calculation and sadism he demonstrated in his crimes, makes him one of the most terrifying serial killers in history. Though Rader's capture brought an end to his reign of terror, The psychological impact of his crimes continues to haunt the survivors and the community. The victims' families are left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, while the rest of the world is left to reflect on the darkness that can exist in plain sight. Stay tuned as we move forward in the next part to examine how the case has influenced modern forensic science, the impact of his crimes on the investigation community, and how it has affected public perception of serial killers. Part 4. The aftermath and lasting impact of the BTK case. Approx. 1,500 words. The emotional aftermath. Survivors and families of the victims. Dennis Rader's arrest in 2005 and subsequent conviction for the BTK murders brought an end to a decades-long investigation. It did not provide the victims' families with true closure. The emotional toll of the murders remained with them long after Rader was taken off the streets. The Otero family, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, and the other victims of BTK were not simply names to be remembered in history. They were real people with families, friends, and futures that were stolen from them for the families of the victims. The confession was bittersweet. While it was a relief to finally know the truth about their loved ones' deaths, the chilling details revealed in Rader's confession were difficult to process. Rader's cold, emotionless recounting of the murders, his taunting behavior, and the psychological games he played with the police added layers of horror to an already devastating situation. For some family members, it was the realization that the person they least suspected had been living among them, blending in as an ordinary man while committing unspeakable crimes. The psychological impact of learning that Rader was someone they had never considered capable of such brutality was deeply jarring. Many family members struggled with feelings of betrayal, wondering how they could have been so unaware of the darkness that lay within him. The community in Wichita, which had lived in constant fear for so long, was also left to deal with the lasting effects of Rader's crimes. While many people in the city had suspected that the BTK killer could be anyone, few ever imagined that he would turn out to be someone they might have known personally. The victims' families were forced to relive their tragedies during the trial, where they had to hear the details of how their loved ones were tortured, killed, and discarded. The victim impact statements delivered during the trial highlighted the immense pain caused by Rader's actions. Family members of the victims often spoke of the devastating loss and how their lives had been forever altered by the events of the past decades. Rader's life in prison, a monster behind bars since convicted and sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Dennis Rader was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Although his trial and sentencing had brought an end to his reign of terror, it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in Rader's life, one in which he would have to live out his days in prison, isolated from society and subjected to the harsh realities of life behind bars. Rader's demeanor in prison was remarkably consistent with the cold, detached persona he had shown throughout his trial and confession. Rader showed little remorse for his actions and remained largely uninterested in engaging with the outside world. Unlike many other serial killers who seek fame or recognition, Rader seemed to prefer maintaining a low profile in prison, continuing his life of detachment from his crimes. One aspect that became evident was Rader's obsession with control. While in prison, he attempted to exert power over others by engaging in manipulative behavior and trying to influence the prison system. He reportedly kept a journal in which he continued to detail his thoughts on the murders and his perceived sense of superiority over those around him. His interactions with other inmates were said to be cold and calculated, as he maintained the same dominant attitude he had used in his earlier life. Interestingly, Rader's time in prison also led to a phenomenon known as the BTK myth. For some, Rader became a symbol of terror, his name synonymous with evil and cunning. It was during this time that the public began to study Rader's actions and personality more deeply, leading to a range of psychological analyses and theories about the motivations behind his killings. Some experts hypothesized that Rader's compulsion stemmed from a deep need for power and control, and his desire to dominate others was reflected in the meticulous planning of his murders. However, his lack of emotional engagement and apparent detachment from the pain of his victims also led some to believe that his personality displayed elements of sociopathy and narcissism. Impact on law enforcement. Lessons learned from the BTK. The investigation into the BTK murders was one of the most complex and frustrating cases in the history of American law enforcement. Over the years, Wichita's police department, along with the FBI, had invested considerable resources into the case, but for many years, they were unable to make significant progress. The case was marked by false leads, dead ends, and a lack of technological advances that could have helped identify the killer more quickly. The BTK case highlighted several crucial issues that would eventually lead to improvements in criminal investigations and forensic science. One of the most significant factors that led to the case's eventual resolution was the advancement in DNA technology. Prior to DNA testing, police had relied on eyewitness accounts, circumstantial evidence, and traditional investigative techniques to solve crimes. However, the BTK case showed how much more could be done with the help of forensic science. DNA testing allowed investigators to match Rader's DNA to evidence collected from crime scenes and letters, ultimately linking him to the murders and leading to his capture. The success of this technique has been widely acknowledged as a turning point in modern criminal investigation practices, with the case acting as a landmark in the use of forensic science to solve cold cases. Furthermore, the BTK case also emphasized the importance of public awareness in serial killer investigations. Rader's ability to evade capture for so long was largely due to the difficulty law enforcement had in identifying suspects, as well as the psychological manipulation Rader employed through his letters. The case underscored the need for law enforcement agencies to work together, share information, and make use of modern databases to track patterns and connections between cases. Cultural impact, BTK's legacy, and the fascination with serial killers. BTK case had a significant cultural impact, both in the true crime community and the broader public. Dennis Rader's life and crime sparked intense fascination and debate about the psychology of serial killers, their motives, and the methods used to catch them. Books, documentaries, and media coverage of the case became a way for people to try to understand what drives someone like Rader to commit such horrific acts. One of the most disturbing aspects of the BTK case was the revelation that Rader had lived among his victims for decades, hiding in plain sight while carrying out his gruesome crimes. This revelation raised troubling questions about how serial killers can blend into society without detection and how they can continue their activities for years without being caught. Rader's ability to remain undetected for so long has become a symbol of the dangerous potential of well-hidden evil. The fascination with serial killers, fueled by cases like BTK, also led to an increased interest in the psychology of such individuals. Experts and researchers began to study Rader's behavior, attempting to pinpoint patterns and triggers that could explain his actions. His case became a textbook example of how a seemingly normal, even respectable person can harbor such violent and sadistic tendencies. However, while there has been much focus on the psychology of serial killers, the BTK case also serves as a reminder of the human cost of such crimes. Real people were impacted by Rader's actions, families were torn apart, communities were left in fear, and the emotional scars of his victims' families remain to this day. Despite the media attention and the fascination with Rader's personality, it is essential to remember that behind every crime is a real victim, whose life was tragically cut short. Conclusion: the enduring shadow of Dennis Rader's arrest and conviction brought a sense of finality to one of the most disturbing chapters in American crime history. His life in prison, his cold demeanor, and the lasting impact of his actions have left an indelible mark on law enforcement and society. The BTK case serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the relentless pursuit of justice. No matter how long it takes, the emotional scars left by Rader's crimes will never fully heal. But the lessons learned from the BTK investigation continue to shape modern criminal investigations. As technology advances and law enforcement agencies work together more closely, cases that once seemed unsolvable are being cracked. The BTK case shows that no matter how long it takes, justice will eventually prevail. Thank you for joining us in today's exploration of the BTK Killer. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more investigations into the dark side of humanity, only here on Room 57, Part 5, the psychological profile of Dennis Rader and the impact on society. Approx. 1,500 words understanding the mind of a killer, the psychological profile of Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader's actions shocked not only his community, but the world at large. The sheer brutality and meticulous planning behind the BTK murders left many wondering about the psychological makeup of the man behind the crimes. In this section, we will explore the psychological profile of Dennis Rader, what drove him to commit such horrific acts, and what his case can teach us about the nature of serial killers. A normal man with a dark secret, Rader's ability to lead a double life, living as a devoted husband, father, and church member, while simultaneously being a sadistic serial killer, was both chilling and perplexing. To those around him, Rader was a quintessential family man. He attended church regularly, had a steady job with the city's code enforcement department, and raised his children with his wife, Paula Rader. Yet behind closed doors, Rader was a man who found satisfaction in the suffering of others. His life as BTK was meticulously hidden, and his ability to compartmentalize his actions, appearing normal on the surface while harboring a dark secret, was a key characteristic of his psychology. Rader's case challenges the traditional idea of what a serial killer looks like. He wasn't an isolated loner or a person living on the fringes of society. Instead, he was an integrated part of his community, a man who can seamlessly blend in while harboring violent tendencies. Many psychologists have pointed out that Rader's crimes were not driven by financial gain or revenge. Instead, he committed his murders for psychological satisfaction. He derived a sense of power, control, and dominance from his crimes. For Rader, the act of binding, torturing, and killing his victims was about asserting control over their lives and the investigation into his actions. Rader's taunting letters to the police and media were further evidence of his need for recognition and control. He wanted to show that he was not just a killer, he was a man who could outsmart the authorities and leave them searching for him for decades. Psychological manipulation and sociopathic traits. Rader displayed traits common in sociopaths. He was manipulative, callous, and showed a complete lack of empathy for his victims. He was capable of coldly calculating every detail of his crimes, from the stalking of his victims to the way he staged the scenes to give himself a sense of superiority. Sociopathy, or antisocial personality disorder, is marked by a lack of remorse, emotional detachment, and a disregard for the rights of others. Traits that Rader exhibited consistently. His ability to emotionally detach from his victim's suffering was evident in his methodical approach to killing. The fact that he could lead a seemingly normal life while simultaneously engaging in such heinous acts speaks to the level of emotional numbness and psychological disconnection Rader had toward others. He was able to engage in compartmentalization, keeping his serial killer persona separate from his everyday life. This mental compartmentalization allowed him to maintain a sense of control, and it kept the two aspects of his life, father, husband, and killer, separated. The evolution of the BTK killings, power and control in the murders. BTK murders displayed a clear pattern of escalating violence. Initially, Rader's crimes were carefully planned, but over time, he became increasingly bold in his actions, sending letters and taunting the police. Each letter was more than just a message. It was a way for him to assert dominance over law enforcement and the public. At the start of his killing spree, Rader's murders followed a routine. He would stalk his victims, carefully selecting women who lived alone or with minimal protection. He would then enter their homes, bind them, torture them, and finally kill them. His preferred method of murder was strangulation, which allowed him to prolong the suffering of his victims, giving him a sense of control. However, as the years passed, Rader's need for attention and validation grew. He sent multiple letters to the police and media, claiming responsibility for the murders and providing chilling details about his crimes. These letters were not only an admission of guilt, they were also a form of psychological manipulation. Rader took pleasure in taunting the police, challenging them to catch him. His need for recognition became more apparent as the years went by, and he reveled in the fear his actions caused. One of the most disturbing aspects of Rader's psychology was his lack of empathy for his victims. He did not see them as human beings, but as objects he could manipulate and control. His victims were nothing more than tools to satisfy his needs. Their suffering was of no consequence to him. What mattered was the control he exercised over them and the sense of power he derived from the act of killing. The role of Rader's family, the blindness of his loved ones. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the BTK case is the realization that Dennis Rader's family, his wife and children, had no idea that he was capable of such horrific acts. For decades, Rader lived a double life. His wife, Paula, believed she was married to a good man, a man who was a father to their children and an active member of the community. But behind closed doors, Rader was a monster, hiding his true identity and dark cravings from those closest to him. The shock and betrayal that Rader's family members experienced after his arrest were profound. Paula Rader was devastated by the revelation that the man she had been married to for so long was not the person she had thought he was. His children, who had grown up with him, were left to grapple with the fact that their father was a serial killer. The emotional toll on his family members cannot be overstated. They were not only victims of Rader's crimes in a direct sense, but they also had to contend with the psychological trauma of living with a man who had led a secret life for so long. This betrayal of trust is a key element in understanding Rader's psyche. His ability to deceive his loved ones and lead them to believe he was an upstanding citizen is part of the psychological profile of a sociopath. Rader's ability to compartmentalize his life as a family man and his life as a killer was part of his need for control. By maintaining this double life, he was able to assert power over his family and the community without anyone suspecting the true nature of his character. The impact of BTK on law enforcement and crime prevention. The BTK case had a lasting impact on criminal investigations and the way law enforcement approaches serial killers. The decades-long investigation into Rader's crimes highlighted several key challenges that law enforcement must deal with when trying to catch a serial killer. One of the biggest challenges was the lack of forensic evidence at the crime scenes. Rader was highly meticulous in his actions, often taking steps to destroy or conceal any evidence that could link him to the crimes. The case also underscored the importance of psychological profiling in serial killer investigations. While law enforcement struggled to find physical evidence, they did begin to develop a profile of the type of person they were looking for. Rader fit the profile of a serial killer. He was organized, methodical, and seemingly normal, but he had a dark side that drove him to commit horrific acts. The eventual breakthrough in the case came through forensic science, specifically DNA testing. Rader's taunting letters and his eventual DNA match were pivotal in bringing the case to a close. The case has since been used as an example of how advances in forensic science can help law enforcement solve even the most challenging and long unsolved crimes. The legacy of BTK. Society's fascination with serial killer Dennis Rader's case has had a profound effect on how society views serial killers. The BTK murders were not just a series of random killings, they were carefully orchestrated acts of sadism and control. Rader's ability to blend into society while committing such heinous crimes has contributed to the fascination with serial killers in popular culture. Documentaries, books, and movies have explored the mind of BTK, and his case has been extensively studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement officers alike. Rader's story also speaks to the human fascination with evil. How could a man who appeared so normal living among us, working with us, going to church with us be capable of such horrific acts? The question of how ordinary people can become monsters is a central theme in many discussions about serial killers, and Rader's case is a perfect example of this paradox. While the media fascination with serial killers can sometimes seem exploitative, it also serves as a warning. Serial killers like Dennis Rader remind us that we must always be vigilant and aware of the people around us. The monsters we fear are not always the ones that stand out, they are often the ones who blend into society, hiding in plain sight. Conclusion. The enduring mystery of BTK serves as a chilling reminder of how a seemingly normal man could live a double life for so many years. Dennis Rader's ability to deceive his family, evade the police, and manipulate the media made him one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history. While Rader is behind bars, his story continues to haunt those who were affected by his crimes and remains an essential study for anyone trying to understand the mind of a serial killer. Even though Rader is incarcerated, his legacy lives on in the ongoing debates about crime, punishment, and the nature of evil. Dennis Rader's case will forever serve as an example of how evil can hide in plain sight, and how important it is for law enforcement to continue using the best available techniques to track down and stop serial killers. As we reflect on this case, we are reminded of the victims, the real people whose lives were cut short by a man who, on the surface, appeared to be one of us. They are the ones whose stories deserve to be remembered, and whose lives are the true measure of the horror that BTK inflicted on the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark side of humanity. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more true crime stories here at Room 57. Part 6, the ongoing fascination with the BTK Killer and the lessons we can learn. Approx. 1,500 words, the enduring fascination with BTK. Serial killers in popular culture. The case of Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK Killer, has not only left an indelible mark on the people of Wichita and the families of his victims, but has also become one of the most widely discussed serial killer cases in American history. The horrific nature of the crimes, Rader's ability to evade capture for so many years, and the chilling nature of his personality have made him a subject of fascination for the media, criminologists, and the public alike. Rader's case continues to be studied in detail, with documentaries, books, and films delving into the psychology of the killer and the meticulous nature of his crimes. However, while it is important to understand the mind of a serial killer, the media fascination with such figures can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, studying Rader's actions and motivations helps law enforcement and psychologists learn how to catch and understand similar criminals in the future. On the other hand, it can risk turning a tragic story of murder into something sensationalized and romanticized, detracting from the real human cost of his crimes. Serial killers as cultural phenomena. Serial killers have long been a fixture of true crime culture and popular media. From films to television shows, books, podcasts, and documentaries, the public's obsession with serial killers like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and BTK has fueled a growing genre of true crime entertainment. This fascination is often fueled by a desire to understand what drives these individuals to commit such horrific acts. While some might argue that this fascination helps raise awareness of important issues, others believe it can become exploitative, with little regard for the victims and their families. In the case of Dennis Rader, his crimes have been discussed and depicted so widely that it is easy to forget the real human beings whose lives were lost. Instead of focusing solely on the killer, we should also focus on the lives cut short, the families devastated, and the communities left in fear for so many years. The problem of true crime glamorization of the more concerning aspects of the true crime genre is its tendency to glamorize criminals, even those as heinous as Rader. The BTK Killer, like other notorious figures, has been the subject of many documentaries, books, and even fictionalized versions of his crimes. This can lead to the romanticization of his actions, where the attention and notoriety given to the killer overshadow the pain and tragedy caused by his crimes. For many people, the glamorization of serial killers in the media creates a fascination with evil that makes it feel distant or disconnected from the reality of what victims go through. This trend raises the question of whether the human cost of the crimes is often overlooked. In the rush to understand the psychology of the killer, Rader himself was able to enjoy the infamy of being a serial killer, and by providing his own narrative through letters and interviews, he capitalized on the attention he received. The psychological impact on the families of the victims. While Dennis Rader may have sought fame and recognition, the real victims of his crimes were the families and loved ones left behind. The psychological trauma inflicted on the survivors of the BTK murders is profound and long-lasting. Though Rader's capture brought justice, it did not offer closure in the traditional sense. How do you heal when the man responsible for destroying your family is someone you never suspected? The Otero family, for example, was completely blindsided by the brutality of Rader's actions. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their 2 children, Joseph Jr. and Shirley, were murdered in their own home. What makes this case even more tragic is that Rader lived nearby, and no one had any idea that the person living among them was capable of such evil. For Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox, 2 of Rader's other victims, the psychological pain was no less. Shirley Vian was a single mother with 3 children, and Nancy Fox was a woman living alone. In both cases, the pain of their deaths was compounded by the loneliness and the long search for answers that followed. Vian's children had to grow up without their mother, and Fox's family had to live with the unsolved mystery of her disappearance for many years. The psychological toll on the families of the victims cannot be underestimated. Rader's actions not only took the lives of innocent people, but also left a long-lasting emotional scar on everyone who was touched by his crimes. The families were forced to grapple with the knowledge that the man who destroyed their lives was someone they had never suspected, someone they thought was just another person in the community. The lingering effects of trauma for many families. The pain of losing a loved one to a brutal crime like this doesn't end with a conviction or a sentence. Even after Dennis Rader's capture and imprisonment, the trauma caused by his actions lingers. Families are forced to live with the horror of knowing that their loved ones suffered at the hands of a sadistic killer, and the details of those murders can never be erased. The BTK case also raised difficult questions for law enforcement, particularly in regard to victim protection and community safety. How could this man have lived among his victims for so long without anyone suspecting him? The question of how a trusted community member could turn out to be a monster highlights the difficulty of identifying serial killers, especially those who appear to be normal members of society. For the families, the realization that Rader had been able to hide in plain sight for so many years was a bitter pill to swallow. The psychological effect of this realization is profound, and for many families, it was difficult to move on from the idea that they had been living so close to the killer for so long. The role of technology in solving the BTK case. Only of the key factors that led to the eventual capture of Dennis Rader was the use of advancing forensic technologies. While Rader had managed to evade capture for more than 30 years, DNA analysis and other forensic tools finally allowed law enforcement to connect the dots and trace the killer's identity. Before the rise of DNA technology, investigators in cases like BTK were forced to rely on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and outdated techniques. The breakthroughs in forensic science in the late 20th and early 21st centuries gave investigators the tools they needed to finally crack the case. In 2004, after Rader sent another taunting letter to the police, forensic scientists were able to retrieve DNA samples from the letters, which were ultimately traced to Rader's daughter. This allowed investigators to begin looking closely at Rader, and in 2005, DNA testing and further investigative work linked him definitively to the murders. The case of Dennis Rader underscores the importance of modern forensic techniques in solving even the most difficult cold cases. The ability to analyze DNA from a crime scene or a suspect's personal items has revolutionized the way investigators approach criminal cases, and the BTK case is a perfect example of how science can help bring justice even after decades of evasion. The psychological lessons. What can we learn from BTK? The case of Dennis Rader teaches us many psychological lessons about the nature of serial killers and the human psyche. Rader's ability to manipulate his victims, his need for control, and his lack of remorse make him an important figure in the study of antisocial personality disorders, narcissism, and sociopathy. Understanding the motivations behind serial killers can help law enforcement and psychologists better identify and track such individuals. Rader's case also teaches us that normality is not always what it seems. A man who appeared to be a respected member of his community could hide a dark and terrifying secret, and his ability to blend into society was part of what allowed him to carry out his crimes for so long. Perhaps the most important lesson from the BTK case is the need to remain vigilant. The reality is that serial killers often blend in with the people around them, and they can be anyone: your neighbor, your colleague, or even your close friend. This underscores the importance of community awareness, psychological profiling, and forensic science in ensuring that those who commit such terrible acts are caught before they can harm anyone else. Conclusion: the end of the BTK nightmare, but the legacy lives on. The arrest and conviction of Dennis Rader marked the end of a nightmare for the victims' families and the residents of Wichita, Kansas. Yet, the BTK case remains a dark chapter in American criminal history, a case that serves as a reminder of the evil that can lurk in plain sight. While justice has been served, the psychological trauma caused by Rader's crimes cannot be undone. The impact on the families of the victims, the community, and the broader world will resonate for years to come. The case also reminds us that serial killers, despite being highly destructive, often remain hidden for long periods of time. By studying cases like BTK, we can learn how to prevent future tragedies and ensure that the safety of individuals and communities remains a priority. Thank you for joining us in the exploration of this harrowing case. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more deep dives into true crime and unsolved mysteries on Room 57.